The receipt entry icon is used for items that are received into inventory regardless of whether or not they are received against an existing purchase order. The word new within the receipt number field indicates that the system accesses the next sequential receipt number. For new receipts, leave this field so the system increments sequentially. To recall a previously posted receipt, enter or select the receipt number. To create a new receipt, enter or select a vendor number. If a vendor is entered that does not exist in accounts payable, the receipt can still continue. However, the vendor must be added before attempting to post any transactions for the vendor in accounts payable. If a user has the appropriate rights, vendors can be added immediately by clicking the New button. This starts the vendor window from within accounts payable, as if it was selected directly in that module. The blue triangle here accesses the vendor address and contact information currently found in the vendor profile. Although changes can be made on this window, the changes entered do not update the vendor's master profile. Changes made on this window are for this receipt only. If permanent changes need to be made to the vendor, those changes should be made in accounts payable. If the receipt is to be entered against a previously posted purchase order, enter or select the purchase order number here. If the receipt is entered against multiple purchase orders, click the From Multiple POs Zoom button, this blue up arrow, and then select the purchase orders to receive items against. Similar to the From Multiple Requisitions feature when creating purchase orders that was discussed earlier. If selected, the item details from all purchase orders appear in the lower portion of this window. If one or more receipts has been posted against the purchase order already, that number of receipts appears, as well as the last receipt number. The system defaults to the date Accpac was started for the receipt date. This date, of course, can be any date, past or future. The date entered determines the fiscal period and year the transactions are posted in General Ledger. If the receipt is entered directly, not from an existing purchase order, you can optionally enter or select a template code. As discussed earlier, template codes provide default settings for various vendor, tax, and text fields to assist in data entry. If the receipt is generated from one or more purchase orders, the template code is not available because the settings have already been determined. If inventory control is in use, accept, enter, or select the location code to which bills for the receipt are sent. Also, optionally enter the location code to identify where new items entered on the receipt are received. Existing item details from purchase orders already have the location code identified. Optionally accept or enter an FOB location where shipping charges begin and the ship via method the vendor uses. If the vendor provides discount terms, the discount code assigned appears here. Then optionally enter any description or reference information. The lower portion of the window displays items if one or more purchase orders was selected. The Completes PO column indicates if the activity for this detail line is complete. A yes value occurs automatically when the item is fully received. Or the value can be manually changed to yes if the item is canceled from the purchase order, or if partially received where no additional items are planned to be received, possibly because the item has been discontinued. The two items existing on the selected purchase order appear on the receipt. Let's assume you only received one case of the fluorescent desk lamps. The other case and the halogen desk lights are back-ordered. To receive an item, enter the receipt information for the item being received. The system defaults to the location entered on the purchase order. Change the location if the item is being received elsewhere. If the item is drop-shipped to a customer directly or another address other than the specified location address, enter yes here. Click the blue up arrow to observe where the item is received. enter the received quantity in the next field, and then the unit of measure of the received quantity. Accpac defaults to the cost entered on the purchase order. If no purchase order is being referenced, the system defaults to the specific vendor cost assigned for the item in inventory control, or the most recent cost for the item. For existing purchase orders, if the cost is different, enter the revised cost amount in the unit cost field. The extended cost is calculated multiplying the quantity by the unit cost. If a detailed line discount is provided, enter the discount percent or amount in these fields. Discounts entered on the purchase order appear here automatically, as it does for the first item, this 3% here. Accpac then displays the extended amount again, factoring any discounts. If tax is included in the cost of the item, the tax amount is displayed next. Items such as petroleum and alcohol are examples of items that have tax factored in the cost of an item. Once again, Accpac displays the net amount, this time factoring out any taxes. This is the base amount Accpac uses to generate the journal entry and to update the cost of the item in inventory control, unless additional costs are factored into the cost of the item. The next field is the weight unit of measure. If weight is assigned to the item in inventory control, Accpac displays the weight unit of measure and the weight of the item. The extended weight is calculated by multiplying the quantity by the unit weight. Enter a quantity in the quantity canceled field if you or your vendor are canceling all or a portion of the detail line. It is possible the item has been discontinued and the vendor is not planning any future shipments. If the quantity received and canceled match the original quantity ordered, the detail line is marked complete when the receipt is posted. The quantity outstanding displays how many items are still to be received, where the received to date field displays the quantity that has been received previously. If the vendor's unique item number was entered on the purchase order, that item number appears next. Next, enter the number of labels you want to print for the items being received. For example, if you receive one case of 24, but stock the items on the shelf by each, you might want 24 labels, so each item is identified with a label in the stockroom. The system then displays the arrival date entered on the purchase order. If a sales order number was entered on the purchase order, the sales order number appears here. After the receipt is posted, the shippable backorders report can be printed to identify the sales order that can now be fulfilled. Optionally enter any comments or instructions that you want printed on the receipt for this item detail or for other reporting purposes later. If a non-stocked item is listed on the receipt, the expense account field displays the general ledger account that posts when the receipt is posted. The account defaults from the PO options icon or from the purchase order. However, the account number can be changed to any expense account. If the item is a non-stock item, the non-stock clearing account associated with the item's account set appears. The account here can also be changed if necessary. The PO number field displays the purchase order number where the item detail originated. This is useful if you are combining more than one purchase order on the receipt, using the From Multiple POs option discussed earlier. If, when entering an item number, a manufacturer's item number is entered instead of the internal inventory control item number, the program displays the manufacturer's item number that was entered in the manufacturer's item number field here. Manufacturer's item numbers can be used in place of the actual internal item number. And finally, optional fields. This is where optional fields, specific to this item detail, are entered. Optional fields assigned to the receipt as a whole are entered using the Optional Fields page. Optional fields are discussed in a later session. Although Accpac automatically calculates tax when necessary, based on the tax settings established with the vendor and item, the Item Tax button is used to view or change the item side of the tax settings. For example, you may have an item that is normally not taxed, but for some reason it is taxed for this particular purchase. The tax settings on this window defaults to the tax settings established when the item was added on the purchase order or from inventory control. Whichever item is highlighted when clicking the Item Tax button determines which tax switches are displayed. Clicking the Item Tax button is the same as pressing the F9 key to zoom in and observe all the fields of the item on one window, as discussed earlier. If any tax settings are adjusted for the item while entering the receipt, click the Calculate Taxes button to have the system recalculate the new tax values. The Receive All button is a quick way to have the system populate the received quantity field with the quantity ordered for all items on the receipt. It can be used even if all items were not received. For example, there might be 10 detail lines of which all but one was received. Click the Receive All button and then edit the received quantity of the item you didn't receive back to 0. That's faster than indicating the 9 you did receive individually. The Taxes page displays the tax settings for the vendor's side of the tax calculation process. As discussed earlier, calculating taxes in purchase orders observes two components: whether the specific item is taxable and if the vendor is taxable. Purchase orders refers to the tax matrix in Common Services discussed in the System Manager section of this course to determine if the item-vendor combination is taxable or not, and if it is, what the tax rate is. The item side of the matrix is determined on the Details tab using the Item Tax button, where the Taxes page here determines the vendor side of the tax calculation. Make changes to the tax settings on this window if this particular receipt requires a tax override. The default settings come from the purchase order if one was referenced. Changes made here do not affect the default tax settings for the vendor. It overrides this receipt only. If tax settings are changed, click the Calculate Taxes button to recalculate the tax amounts. The Additional Cost page is where non-specific inventory expenses are entered. For example, expenses such as shipping or handling fees that may or may not be factored into the cost of the items being received. Additional costs can be entered for the vendor shipping the items or for other independent vendors. For example, there may be a customs or duty fee that's paid to the government when items are shipped from other countries. Enter or select the vendor number that needs to be paid for the additional cost. The system displays the vendor tax group, term code, and rate settings if multi-currency is configured. The middle section of the window is where the additional cost information is added. Enter or select the additional cost that the vendor is charging. Then enter the additional cost amount. Accpac provides several ways to prorate the additional cost. No proration indicates to directly expense the additional cost to the expense account entered in this field. Prorate by quantity prorates the additional cost amount by the percentage of the item quantity against the quantity total for all items being received. For example, if the additional cost is $10 and 4 of item A is received and 6 of item B is received, $4 additional cost is allocated to item A and $6 additional cost is allocated to item B, even if item B is half the cost of item A. Prorate by cost prorates the amount of the additional cost by the cost percentage of an item against the entire cost of all items being received. For example, if item A costs $10 and item B costs $90, 9/10 of the additional cost is allocated to item B, where only 1/10 of the additional cost gets allocated to item A. This is the most common allocation method because it more accurately factors the cost base on the item cost ratio. Prorate by weight prorates the additional cost by the weight of the specific item against the weight of all items being received. For example, if the additional cost is $10, and the weight of item A is 1 pound, and the weight of item B is 9 pounds, the amount allocated to item A is $1, where the additional cost allocated to item B is $9, assuming only one each of item A and B is on the receipt, even though item A may be 10 times the price of item B. The prorate manually option allows you to manually enter the allocation amounts for each item upon the receipt being entered. If this option is selected, the Distribute Proration field becomes available to the right. Distribute the additional cost amount shown in the upper right corner of the window to the desired item. The total allocated amount for all items must match the total additional cost amount. The Reproration Method field determines what should happen if any of the items on this receipt are returned to the vendor in the future. The Leave option keeps the allocated amount with the item number and distributes it among the other items. For example, if the total cost of all item A's is $100, and one of item A is being returned to the vendor costing $10, of which $2 is additional cost, the total cost for all item A's after the item is returned is $92. Therefore, the additional cost of $2 originally assigned to the item being returned remains with the item number A, where it is distributed to the remaining item A's. One interesting point regarding the Leave option is if you return all the quantity of item A still has a cost associated with it even though the quantity is 0. This cost is the allocated cost that was assigned to the item when it was originally received. The prorate option takes the additional cost amount that was allocated to the item when it was received and distributes it to the other items, if any, that were on the original receipt. So, if on the original receipt there was one item A and one item B, each having a $1 additional cost value allocated, if you return item A, the $1 allocated cost associated with item A gets assigned to item B. Now item B has $2 additional cost. If item A was the only item on the original receipt, then the prorate option works like the Leave option, leaving the additional cost with item A. The Expense option directly expenses the allocated additional cost to the return account listed here, if an item is returned later from this receipt. The next few fields determine tax settings for the additional cost. If tax changes need to be made, click the Cost Tax button, similar to the Item Tax button discussed earlier. Then optionally enter any reference or comments regarding the additional cost. The Optional Fields field is where optional field values are assigned to the additional cost on a line-by-line basis. The Optional Fields page displays any optional fields assigned to the receipt header. Optional fields are discussed in a later session. If multi-currency is installed and configured for the database, a rates page is available. This is where changes can be made to the exchange rate information if the vendor's source currency is different than the company's functional currency. Optionally change the rate type, date associated with the exchange rate, or the actual rate itself. The Totals page displays the Receipt Totals window. Optionally enter a general comment that prints on the receipt, and view the total weight of the items on the receipt for those items where weight was entered. Also observe the receipt subtotal, any entered discounts, the calculated tax amount, and the receipt total. The bottom portion of the window contains another row of buttons. These buttons are visible from any page.
Hello?
Click the Post button when the receipt is ready to be posted. As discussed earlier, the History button inquires on previous purchases and receipts for item vendor combinations. For example, you may want to view the details of any other receipt entered against the purchase order. The Invoice button is available on the Receipts window if the invoice and receipt of the items are sent together and both documents are to be processed at once. This window, when completed, creates an invoice in Accounts Payable for the items being received. If you already know the invoice information, enter the invoice number provided by the vendor sending the items in the primary vendor invoice number field. Subsequent vendors, those vendors other than the primary vendor entered on the additional cost page, can also be invoiced directly by entering their invoice number in the lower section of the window. If the invoice comes later, use the invoice entry icon. When the receipt is complete, click the Post button. You then have the option to print the receipt immediately or save it so it can be printed later.
Let's take a look at invoice entry.